Hello, and welcome to the South Coast Artists Index, where artists, performers, and writers, as well as curators, directors, and supporters, anyone with ties to the creative community, drops by to introduce themselves to you. We'll talk about their beginnings, their vision, their passion, and so much more. The South Coast Artist Index podcast is brought to you in part by Heavenly Spirits, who invites you to celebrate the art of life and creative communities everywhere. Learn more at heavenlyspirits.com.
Hi, this is Ron Fortier with another episode of the In Focus podcast, brought to you by the South Coast Artist Index and co-sponsored by Heavenly Spirits, who in their graciousness allows us to continue this incredible journey that we're on. As per usual, I'm going to ask our guest to introduce themselves and to spell their names.
Okay. Good morning. I'm Jane Ferris Richardson. Do you really want the spelling of the whole thing? It's long.
Yes.
Okay. JaneFerrisRichardson.
The reason why I do that is because people have, told me that, I'm traveling in my car and I heard someone's name. I don't know if I heard it correctly. And, I had a pen or something that I could jot the name down, and it's very important. I still go back to not hearing the announcer on WGBH, Aaron Roth's name correctly, because to me it sounded like Arun Ra. I was like, oh my God, he's the sun god. So anyway, with that out of the way, and even with, in some cases, out of the 75, almost 80 podcasts that we've conducted so far, even with the most simplistic names, you would think that people wouldn't have a problem with it. And they do.
Got it. And they're very important. I decided when I got married that I would keep my original name as part of my name, but with no hyphen. I thought that was a bit much. But I did add David's name, David Richardson, also a New Bedford artist, because I thought it would be less complicated if everyone in the family shared at least part of a last name.
And it believe it or not, I've done genealogy for quite a long time. It's a family of genealogists, actually. And on my Portuguese side, because they dropped the name for some reason, I remember being, taking advantage of their socialized medicine there, and being at a clinic and just for a checkup as part of my, at that time, temporary residency. And they would call out names of people, and it'd be Manuel Armando de Souza Ferreira Lopes. And even with me, Ronald Roland Fortier. And they would address you as Mr. or Senor Ronald Roland Fortier. And it's, very traditional, very, cultural. But going into genealogy, where with my grandfather, Eduardo Moraes, that's it. That's all I've got to go on. And it's very, very difficult because which one of these Eduardo Moraes is he? And then in our own family with Paula, Paula's legal name is Paula Bachelor 40. She's like, that's way too much to write down.
Well, there's another historic aspect that one of my colleagues just highlighted yet again, which is that when women artists get married, sometimes they get lost because they completely change their name, and it's difficult to backtrack and find what they were doing before and how it connects. That's really interesting.
And I think too, with the whole European thing, with maintaining their maiden name as part of their legal married name, I mean, we can get into the whole gender issues and so on and so forth, but there's a little bit more to it than that, because family names carried a lot of weight. And yes, a woman becomes almost invisible upon marriage, and that's not really a fair thing. I've also noticed too, in the Black community, a lot of women, especially those who are more educated, come from different backgrounds. They also retain their maiden names, which is a really cool thing. Again, because are you related to so and so? You still maintaining your identity. That's very, very important. Speaking of identities, my God, you wear a lot of hats.
Yes. So thank you for the opportunity to look at that, because, as much as we have loved living in New Bedford, I have spent an awful lot of time commuting during the time that I've lived in this area. So a lot of what I do is kind of invisible here. So I'm happy to talk about that. And I'm excited also, Ron, to have an opportunity to speak from the perspective of the work that I do as an artist. And that being said, I'm in my art therapy office. And because I work primarily with children and families, that's why you see all these things that are behind me. Because I'm also trained as a play therapist, and I realized I have a very metaphorical approach. I do a lot of work creating these little worlds in a tray of sand. That's sand tray therapy. And it's very, very, very visual. It's like you're using a language of images, which is interesting because my work is mostly non-objective, my artwork, but I am really attached to all these other images, which pop up from time to time in the work as well.
Can you tell me that? Because, as a, I guess I'm calling myself now a recovering abstractionist, because I've gone into social expressionism. I have no idea what the heck it is, but it's something that I had to avoid for quite a long time. And but you're dealing with objective things, the play therapy, the art therapy, and yet your own artwork is subjective. Could you give us your reasons for it? In my particular case, my wife said that I was hiding my emotions in my abstraction when I could swear that I was painting sang-froid, cold-bloodedly, and my only goal was to paint nothing, which I was lying to myself all along.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. I just said something to my students the other day, and speaking of hats, that's another hat, is that I'm a professor and I teach art therapy to some wonderful undergraduate students. And we were talking about a section in the text that we're reading, which is about very concrete imagery representing events in the author's life. The author happens to be an art therapist, also an exhibiting painter. And he talks about how important these images are. And I said something like, here is where I somewhat part ways with him. These images are really powerful. They're really important. This is a large part of the work that we do, helping people to connect to their stories, make sense of their stories, focus them through creating an image. But I actually believe that so much can go into that non-objective work, that whole experience, that whole breadth of feeling, that depth, that we really don't even know where the bottom is. So it's kind of the reverse, Ron, of what you were saying. It's sort of like a container that you can put everything in. And that being said, it doesn't mean that I don't really like to draw. I don't have loads of time to do that. I really do like to go out into the landscape, into the world. And figures do crop up in what I'm doing, but it tends to be more non-objective and sometimes patterned.
Okay.
But the story is in there somewhere because I'm very, very interested in personal narrative and how it surfaces in various ways in different contexts. It's very different in art than it is, say, in a therapy setting or in a classroom, but it's all related.
It's funny, someone in jest, and I've heard this several times from several different people over a span of time, not just during this pandemic, which seems to be altering the emotional landscape of a lot of people. I have a friend of mine who's a therapist who said, wow, I thought I had been exposed to everything, but this one is, I just don't know how to put my finger on it, and anymore. I said, hey, I'm a former marketing guy. I'm be very, very curious. And his first therapies at the outbreak, were certain types of people, professionals specifically, who were going out of their minds because they felt completely impotent in handling the crisis that we're going through. And then it became parents alone because they didn't know how to handle their children at home. And then they felt guilty that they really didn't know their children because they spent so much of their time making a living to try to make their children comfortable. And then there was the children who felt completely cut off. And so it's just an amazing thing. But the theme that I've heard was, thank God for art, or else the asylums would be full.
So I have been framing that in a more positive way with students, with others, and suggesting that the most important thing that we're going to explore right now is the way in which art is a resource, not an assignment, not something to master, not a sequence of accomplishments, but what does that mean if you really go deeply? I think I've used that word about 3 times already. It is an intense time, right? But how can art be a resource at a difficult time? And also, how do we consider that at least some of the time that we have is a gift? I was walking one day in the neighborhood and somebody had written in colored chalk on the sidewalk, "What will you do with the gift of time?" And I thought, boy, that is really great. Now, mind you, we weren't as far into the pandemic at that point. So it struck me perhaps as a little more poetic as it might have, because this has been going on for a long time. But I still think that's really, really important, because we're always reinventing things in art, right?
Yes, constantly. And sometimes from out of the blue. You're almost having that out of body experience, like, where did that come from as you're doing it? And so many people have been relating that kind of those kind of experiences that they said they've never really either had those experiences or paid attention to those experiences.
Right. Yeah, a lot of us, I think, are paying attention to things in a very different way. And I think that's very good. And I know for myself, I have this sense of rediscovering different kinds of connections. So for example, I have spent some time over the last 12 years um, working with arts therapists in China. I've been there a couple of times. I've been to Hong Kong. My very close colleague, Chun Hong Wang, has been here several times. She's been at my house. She's been in New Bedford. She's been at school. We've given presentations together. And so starting before I went to Beijing for the first time, I did a lot of what felt like art history homework, but it was very, very compelling because it was soon to become real. And I learned a lot about the relationship of the art and the artist. And then on another level, adding another layer, what's the relationship of the painting to the landscape, of the artist to the landscape, and what is embodied in the work. So I learned that there was a concept, and I think that you will like this, that art is like a heart print of the artist. And I read that. It's actually, I've read that first in a book by Malcolm Pern, who's a curator at the Met in New York. And I called up one of my best friends, who's a serious artist and also an art therapist. And I said, "You're not going to believe what I just read. They're saying art is like a heart print." This kind of sounds similar to what we encourage people to do. Not quite in those words, that might sound a little bit woo-woo, but to encourage people to really connect with what they're creating. So that was fascinating to me. And I'm finding that, with the time to reflect, those associations, come up more.
Yeah.
In thinking about the work. And also, because I work with students all the time, and not only do I have the responsibility to give them this foundation and this discipline, but I also have a different kind of responsibility to support them right now, so that they can do the work, so that they, can clear some space in their lives, in a very stressful and chaotic moment, to think about the work. So everything has taken on a certain gravity.
Yeah,
Hasn't it?
the gravitas is very, very palpable. There are people who one of the worst, maybe worst is not a good word. One of the most emotional experiences I ever had in the classroom was teaching at the community level for Sandria Parsons and South Coast Network, I think it was called, or South Coast Learning Network. And it was adult learners. It was the first time I'd ever dealt with adult learners, some of them older than me at that time. And it was like the Society of Wounded Birds. It was horrible. Here were people who wanted to resurrect, recreate, renew any of the words. If you've ever read Clotaire, Dr. Clotaire Rapai's concepts, he's a child psychiatrist from France who ended up as a major marketing guru, but that's another story. But these people who, they were told at some point in time that the joy that they had in doing art was childlike. Put down the crayon, put down the pencil. It's time to be an adult. It's time to go make a living. There's no time for that kind of experience. And some of them, went out into careers, and now they're hitting that midpoint of their lives where they're wondering, was I ever good enough to be the artist I thought I was? And I just found that absolutely sad, because when you go into a classroom of children, the best part of them is that they have no idea what their boundaries or what their limitations are if they're taught correctly. I had a friend that I graduated with in BFA class of 75 at the then SMU, Southeastern Massachusetts University, today's University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. And he said that his high school art teacher was afflicted with Alzheimer's, and continued to teach high schoolers in the way that they then taught elementary school children. A turkey is for Thanksgiving, a pumpkin is for Halloween, a Christmas tree is for Christmas. And that was the full extent of his education. But he persevered on his own and continued to paint and draw as he always had.
It really is not about doing critique-based work. They do lots of work. They do lots of work on their own, and they do work in class, but it is not evaluated the same way you would say if you were in a still life class and everybody had 3 paintings, all of the same size, but using different approaches, and there would be a very systemic way of evaluating them. And I'm not saying that that's a necessarily bad thing. You know, people want to grow, you know, in their ability to make work. They want to learn new things. You know, nobody wants to be confined or, you know, cut off from the sources of their own growth, you know, as a person or an artist, which I think is part of what you're describing. That sometimes happens, but people do want to get better. So one thing I say that's reassuring is nobody ever became worse at drawing from doing all these journal entries for this class. And yet, you know, we are not evaluating these in the same way that you would be doing in a studio class. So that's kind of a fascinating dynamic. And, you know, it also spills over into doing work, because all of us can make work on a number of different levels. I mean, you can be doodling on a piece of paper, which can turn into what one of my colleagues calls a mindful doodle, which really starts to focus your attention and maybe even help you think something through, you know, or you can do sketches, or you can do something more finished. Sometimes what I've heard from people is that they don't feel, they sort of don't feel comfortable moving between those different levels. So in other words, either people feel like they want to make work that is destined to be in a gallery, or they want to do things in an art journal that are very, very private, but they don't move along that continuum. I think it's interesting to do that, and it's important to do that. And, you know, when people say, well, do you make any art? I say, yeah, it's a slow output because of other responsibilities, but I don't stop doing it, and I don't stop thinking about it. And the process is different at all those points, if that makes sense.
It does. I remember one of our first reunions of the BFA class of 75. It's interesting to see, you know, nearly 50 years later, everybody at this point in their lives, and yet the emotions, the memories are as vivid as if it was last Wednesday. That was another shocker. That happened to me with my MFA class in Miami. Everybody said it's like I went into the bathroom and came out. That's what happened. Mm-hmm. You know, there was none of this enormous spirit. You know, it's almost like picking up our own, you know, finishing each of the sentences and that kind of camaraderie and togetherness and such. But a lot of us had to go to alternate and sometimes parallel careers. And I thought I was the strange one by thinking, well, even when I couldn't paint, I continued to paint in my head. And that's what sustained me. I mean, I did advertising and layout and so on and so forth, but after 80, 90 hours a week of doing that, there was just nothing left for pleasure, for art, for just simply for the pleasure of it. And nearly everyone that I interacted with and related that painting in my head thing all said the exact same thing. They had jobs that were so boring and so maddening that they would look at objects and paint them in their head. And then to their amazement, when they picked up a brush again, in some cases 20, 30 years later, they were shocked at their adeptness. It's, oh my God, how is this possible? How is this possible? But then, you go into stories of the Hanoi Hilton, stories of some of the POWs who learned how to play classical piano or guitar or lower their handicap in golf without ever actually touching a keyboard, a fretted instrument, or an actual real golf club. It's the human spirit is just phenomenal.
Rehearsing something in your mind is really powerful. Ballet dancers sometimes do that. They like on their hand. It's like, this is the combination.
So you are a dancer as well. Are you a ballet dancer or a?
This is like a long time ago. I was really fortunate to grow up outside of New York City, in a relatively small town, but straight line into the city. So that meant that I had access to the city and to people who were coming from the city. So I went to a very serious ballet school from a fairly young age. My decision, not my parents' decision, and remained very involved in that and did some performing in a regional ballet company, and then in college, and even coming back to dance when I was in Boston getting my doctorate. I was kind of the opposite of the people who get hyper focused when they do their grad degree. I just needed a break. And I was the boss at my job. I was a journal editor, and I could hang a sign on the door and say lunch break, and I would go to ballet class. But I also really loved art. I went to art classes. My mom was very good at, finding experiences, finding supplies. I remember she came home one day with this huge cardboard box, and it was full of acrylics. And she said, they've invented this cool new paint. I thought this would really be fun. And she had gotten a lot of colors wrong. It was wonderful. I still remember taking everything out. And, when you're a kid, at some point you feel like maybe you can do everything. You don't feel those barriers. You don't necessarily feel the need to choose, although practically speaking, if you want to dance, it kind of chooses for you because you need to put in many, 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 many hours, which in a way was not a bad thing. I hear stories of people's early experiences, stuff that I just completely skipped because I was doing other things. But I was always really interested in art. And when I came to Lesley, where I now teach, and I had my interview for the graduate program to learn to be an art therapist, my then advisor, now colleague, Sean McNiff, said, you want to be in the dance corps group, right? And I said, no, I want to be in the art group. I want to do lots of art. This is what I'm doing now. But I always went back and forth between the two. Although I had to I sort of put together my art school experience. I did take studio classes at Bennington, but I was also doing dance and psychology. that was my primary focus. And then I was lucky enough to get a teaching job in New York, at a school that paid tuition for outside classes. So every Saturday I would go to painting class at the Brooklyn Museum Art School. It was a wonderful, wonderful place. And I was fortunate to be able to go there full time for a little while back in the days before they closed. And then before I moved to Boston, I had saved all my money from teaching preschool, and I went to France and was in an intensive art program in the south of France. So, I started with dance. I was always interested in art, and I was, lucky enough as an adult to find places that I could, do some really serious study.
As a ballet dancer, when it came to the figurative in drawing class, especially, do you feel you had probably no pun intended, a leg up on everybody else because you could feel not just the subject, the motif in space, as the other students were learning to do, but you could feel you as the motif in space. So you knew, for example, that when the model was leaning up against something, you knew exactly where the pressure points were. You knew what the alignment of the spine was. Yeah.
This is what it's going to be like. Yeah, kinesthetically, yes, I do think so. And I'm also thinking of, how ballet is very formal, it's very balanced. I still really love it. I also rebelled at one point and started going to the Merce Cunningham studio in New York. And one other girl and myself were the youngest people. This was like not a teenage thing in those days. It probably still is not. But we were taking the training to the city, as we called it, every day during summer vacation. And we would get there and everybody else was like in their 20s. We thought they were wildly sophisticated. They were all, some of them were performing, some of them were waiting tables, some of them were working at a bookstore. Some of them, I think, were college students. And I had this, incredibly cool experience. And the reason that I throw that in is, that's a very different way, of looking at balance and of looking at space. I mean, it's not incongruent. I mean, New York City Ballet used to do Merce Cunningham's Summer Space, and it's a very beautiful, beautiful production. But it was another way of kind of looking at how people move and how people balance and how they relate to one another and timing and all of those things. And I do think that I'm interested in, this is going to sound a little silly. How could I not be interested in space? You're creating a space in a painting, but I do really think about that, and that things are inhabiting this space and moving through this space. And that's part of, that comes back, I think. Wow, thank you, Ron. I just realized this talking to you. But it comes back to, I think, the argument that I make about non-objective work in art therapy is you've got this space and something is inhabiting it. And the interesting thing is to figure out what it is and to figure out what needs to be there. And it doesn't necessarily need to be a literal figure, but the space has to be there for anything to happen.
Yeah.
And the movement has to happen or it's going to be totally boring.
Exactly. And a lot of people don't really understand abstraction, subjective, non-objective work. It's very, very, very difficult. And that was, why one of the goals I convinced myself that that's what I was doing, that I was attempting to paint nothing, because one of the things about abstraction, the moment you put in a horizontal line, you're screwed. There's no other way it becomes landscape. And anything, vertical, all of a sudden now becomes figurative. So it's amazing how the human mind will, well, Ernst Gombrich, who wrote The Story of Art, still my favorite art historian, and that was always my preferred text when I was teaching art history, would always speak about the viewer's share, that regardless of what you put down on that canvas, it almost doesn't matter, because the viewer, their share is going to be much more valid perhaps than yours, because they're coming from only one vantage point, and that's looking at your work. They have no idea what was going on. So that's interesting. Although I'll tell you, I had an opening in Chicago, and it was uptown. It was near Koreatown. And one of the partners in the gallery was Asian. He was Korean himself. And so there were a lot of Asian people in the gallery for the opening. A lot of late 20, mid 30 Asian women, all college students. And I remember telling them about, I'm painting cold-bloodedly, and I'm painting nothing. And the most amazing thing was how I remember the gasp that they had, and they sort of leaned towards me all as a group and went, no. And then they each described, which was very eerie, exactly what was going through my head at the time I was painting those, a specific painting, which I was flabbergasted. I had no idea, how could they possibly have picked up on that?
Wow.
So, there is this incredible language. Let's go back to France. Having an art education in France is one thing, but what else did you leave France with?
Well, it was hard to leave.
Yeah.
And I was coming home to go to graduate school, to plunge into something very serious. I knew I really liked working with children, and I was fascinated by the ones that were having a hard time. That's why I decided to be a therapist and not to keep teaching, although that was great background. But where I went in Lacoste was a very small art school that had been started by a painter named Bernard Freem, an American painter, friend of many surrealists in particular. It was in this absolutely beautiful place in the Luberon, small village completely made out of stone. And it was a small group of students. It was a very intense community. I was only there for the summer, although people could be there during the school year as well. And I think that what I experienced was this very intensive art making environment. That was what we did. Is get up and do a lot of work. And we would go and, we would draw in an orchard that was very reminiscent of some of those Van Gogh ink drawings. And actually that was one of the assignments, was to do a huge ink drawing in that orchard with a very, very thin bamboo pen, the kinds that Van Gogh would have used, and with the color of ink that he would have used. So it was very immersive, being in the landscape, doing a lot of work. There was a wonderful art therapist there, Crystal Woodward, an artist and art therapist, who taught a course called Creative Process. That was fascinating and kind of got me thinking of what's the bridge between making art and doing art therapy, which is what I was about to learn. But I think what I came away with, aside from the opportunity to speak a lot of French, which I had learned in school, was that it was really up to me to sustain this process. that it was really up to me to decide whether I was going to say, oh, I'm a graduate student, I'm really busy, I'm not going to make any art, or whether I was going to say, life is complicated, it beats being bored, and how am I going to do these things? So I really tried to sustain making some work. I am proud to say that I was the person on graduation who organized a student show for the first time. We took over the Marin Gallery at Lesley, where I now have curated many shows for students. And my graduating seniors always have a capstone show. That's not something I began, but it's something that I work with them on now. So I, as a student coming in, basically just said, oh, can we do this? Can we go in this direction? Can we encourage everybody to go look at their work, or maybe do more work, or maybe finish work? And can we please acknowledge that this is important? This is part of the work that we do. So I think that was very sustained by going to France. And I remember coming home and saying to one of my friends, I think the friend who picked me up at the airport, and saying, this all feels, it was so much fun. It was so wonderful. I'm really going to miss it, but it all feels more serious. And I learned something about how to focus. So I think I've really looked for that when I was living in Boston, doing my doctoral program years later. In addition to going to ballet class at lunchtime, I started taking a watercolor class with students of Kaji Aso. Unknown to me at that time, my husband, David, was also a student of Kaji Aso, but I had not met him.
He's quite an alumnus of Kaji Aso artists in this area. It's
yes,
kind of interesting.
Many. I recently found out that a fellow art therapist studied with him at the museum school. He was a very influential teacher at the museum school, and then started his own studio, very much encouraged by his students. And that studio is still going. I actually met my husband there in a drawing class. After I had been doing watercolor, the teacher had been saying, oh, you should stop by drawing class sometime. And I did. And there I met David. And my son, Gabriel, is an artist. And he has also been a part of that studio from time to time, and been very aware of that approach since he was a little boy. But this is kind of circling me back to your experience at the opening with the women who came and looked at your work and said, there's so much there. There's so much in that work. Because there's really a balance at the studio between doing very expansive, non-objective work and work from life, or work in the landscape, work in nature. And there was a real interplay, in a way that was very integrated. And I always really liked that. That was a good fit for me.
The spirituality in work, I mean, in my particular case, Alma Cummings, her dad, Herb Cummings, was my instructor. I still have difficulty speaking about him. But I'll never forget the lecture that he did on the on the six persimmons. And as a student, oh my God, Herb never goes on and on and on this long. But as you mature, all of a sudden you get that cold bucket of water out of nowhere when you're minding your own business a few years later. And I believe the monk that did it against, monks just didn't do artwork. I think it was Muji was his name. But the interplay between the persimmons was just phenomenal. And there is the spirituality that once you're dipped in it, is very, very, very difficult to get out of it. So that does come into play. 3 words that I would like to review with you, because we're going to start winding down in a bit. And this has gone by very, very quickly. So that's a good sign that this is a really good conversation. My wife, when I get depressed or anxious, always says, look, you have a choice. Do you want to be sustained by your art, or do you want to be supported by it? Choose. I said, I can't have both. And she said, absolutely not. Only one.
Oh, Paula is so smart.
Oh, yeah. She is. So I still have problems with that sometimes. And what's your take on being sustained by it versus being supported by it?
Wow. I think it's tricky. I think it depends on how you define those things. So I think my answer is a little bit that it's dynamic.
Okay.
Is that okay to say?
I think so. Because there are artists who are supported by their art, and you say to yourself, not as a critic, but my gosh, how are they making a living doing that?
Oh, you know what? It's so funny. I didn't even think about that kind of material sense.
Yeah.
But I was thinking more, physically supported, like buoyed up.
Yeah.
So for me, supported is like this dimension,
right,
helping to hold things up.
I think there's a double meaning in her. Yeah.
Is helping to carry things.
Right. Where you have people who are sustained by their artwork, and yet they go almost unnoticed, which is kind of crazy. And then the other word, the one word I think is the most heinous word ever used for artists is talent. Do you believe in talent?
I don't know that that's a really helpful concept. And I could use my son as a quick example. So Gabe is an artist. He's very proficient. And in high school, he was the art star, but he was also always being told he was just way too smart to be doing this, to be doing art. So you could analyze that situation and say, oh, this was the most talented kid. Isn't that great? And he went in this direction in spite of being discouraged by many, not by his art teacher, not by his family, certainly. Or maybe he had something else. I think clearly he has something else, which is a real focus, and a vision to sustain the work. I mean, he's been doing things in New York, and he said, I'm the only one out of my class, out of his MFA class. He's the only one who's in New York. I mean, there is a pandemic right now. It's difficult enough to be anywhere, but I think that's another dimension, of energy that isn't just talent. So, and I think also coming from the perspective as a teacher, as a therapist, someone who has also taught child psychology, I know a lot about development. It's maybe not the most useful concept.
Yes, I hate that term.
And it's not very motivating. And I know we're almost at a close, but going back to the hats, I do a fair amount of writing. So when I do that, I really need to do a lot of research as well, and look at what people have been saying, historically, theoretically, philosophically. And that's, fortunately, I like to write. I'm not a person who feels like they're in that position, oh, I have to write something or I won't keep my job.
Right.
I actually like to write. But it really helps with perspective, and also with, just like choosing, where you're going to put something in a painting, or particularly the dot paintings that we used to make with Mr. Aso, literally a teeny weeny little dot of color, a whole painting. Why are you putting this blue over here and another one over there?
Echoes.
These decisions on this really minuscule level,
Yeah.
it gives you perspective. I think writing gives perspective as well. That's been very, very valuable.
Yeah, I mean, well, look at yourself between your dance, space and movement, writing, which is descriptive. That there's a whole nother set of brain cells for that. And then as a painter, I mean, you're very well rounded when comparative to a lot of other people who just focus on one thing and say, in art school they always try to get you well rounded by having you write art statements. Art statements are like nails on a chalkboard for me. I don't like reading other people's art statements because they're horrible. In fact, I wonder if anybody's ever published a book of horrible art statements, because they wouldn't be very difficult to find.
There's some essays actually that are kind of interesting.
Really?
I do that with my students, and it's really it's hard. I tell them, oh, this is going to be much harder than your final paper.
Yeah. The only art statement I've ever read, and it's a mutual friend, was Lasse Antonsen. And I went, my God, he should teach this because I hate writing them as much as I hate reading them. So if I hate writing mine, then definitely you're going to hate reading mine, because, the old fallback was always, well, professor, if I could write about it, I wouldn't do it, which is so wrong.
Right.
It's an immature response.
It's a different, so here's where the therapist's perspective is coming in. It's a different language. It's able perhaps to look at, another aspect of the work, or to look at it in a different way. It's just like we say with children. And I've been very influenced by Reggio Emilia, where I got a grant to go there and look at how they work with children with a variety of needs. But they talk about different materials being like different languages, not just, art is like a language. Let's let children express themselves. It's like something special happens when you work with natural materials. Mm-hmm. And guess what? Something else happens when you work with clay. And another thing happens when you work with paint. And if it's a different kind of paint, that's not going to be the same. You can see my room here. You can't see into the art closet, mm-hmm. but I have a lot of art materials. Considering that I mostly work with fairly young people, I have lots and lots of choices. That is really deliberate, and I have nice materials. I don't have like Mr. Sketch markers or anything like that.
Yeah, but then again, it doesn't really require a heck of a lot. I mean, I grew up an only child for the first 12 years, and my upbringing in New York City, with granduncles. Well, she wasn't even really my aunt. She was his domestic partner. That's a whole nother story. He was a newspaper publisher. And
New York is full of stories. Sometime we have to talk about New York.
Yes. Yeah, we will. But one of the things is the human hand is so incredible. I mean, if you just took a chunk of clay and dropped it in somebody's hand and tell them, all I want you to do is pop it up and down. I just want you to pop it up and down as if it were a ball, and watch what happens. It turns mm-hmm. into a ball naturally without you manipulating it. And so this, I mean, I see my grandson who felt, he's 7 years the junior of his sister, and he felt overshadowed by her. She's brilliant, she's beautiful, she's, all those things, the whole package. And yet I see his hands when we used to work on these projects for school when he was in elementary school, and he made me want to weep. I felt like weeping, just the way his hands went over something. Maurice Jospert, I don't know if you remember him from the Candleworks restaurant. He was a Belgian gentleman. Never call a Belgian a Frenchman. But anyway, I remember one at some event, he was with his wife. He never touched her. He put the palm of his hand about an inch or two away from between her shoulder blades and went down her spine and around her buttocks. And just that one sweeping motion was exactly what you get in art class. You do that gestural move. You have to look at the model and pick up that model and that one shot, line that has life to it. That's not bent wire or noodles.
It's like this. It's energetic.
Exactly.
And it's, just because it isn't exactly definable does not mean that it's not real. And that's another strong influence from the work that I did in China and learning about traditional medicine is, this energy that goes into gestures. So there's another answer, Ron, of why there's a lot in that work, in that non-objective work. There's all that energy. There's the energy of the gesture and of the material and your energy and what is transmitted.
Yeah, someday we're going to have the conversation because David and I have had it online a couple of years back before I went to Portugal with Cy Twombly, which is a whole nother adventure. But
Yes.
There was something from the father singer Marisa that I heard yesterday, and to close this out, and you brought this thing up about time at the beginning of this podcast. And it's funny because I've heard this before and I was touched by it. And roughly translated, because Portuguese is a very difficult language to the uninitiated, but it's the better of me, melhor de mim, or the best of me, but it's not really the best, it's the better of me.
I'm writing that down.
Yeah, and I'll send you the link. The idea of time is so critical. And where did it just go now? She sings about waiting for me, okay? That you have to lose to win later. That the storm is going to pass. That where is the reference to time? I lost it for some reason.
You'll find it.
Yeah, but I'll send it to you. It's really it's life. Life goes on and doesn't wait for us. But there's a line from the song that was not picked up on the lyrics for some reason. It's about taking the time for time. You have to ask time for time. And I think that's what this pandemic has given us, has been time, and we're not as Americans used to having time. I mean, we have 2 weeks vacations, which the Europeans, as you know, like, what's wrong with you people? 2 weeks? That's half of a vacation. In some countries that's a third of a vacation. It's 6 weeks.
Really?
As you know. So this has been wonderful. I definitely would like to have you back on the show. There's just so much to talk about, so much I want to learn about. And I would like to do one specifically on the pandemic and how you have seen it affecting people and how art has been a key player, so to speak, in the adjustment to this pandemic, or the creating an ability to deal with this pandemic. The words in the back of my head, it just won't come out towards the front.
So, yeah, that's fascinating. My son, Gabriel, works for the Brooklyn Rail, and the Brooklyn Rail has had this wonderful series of events on Instagram. So they are also video, and they're called the New Social Environment. Isn't that a great name?
Yeah.
I hate personally the new normal. I refuse to say that.
No.
But the new social environment, is much more dynamic, more challenging, more interesting. And they have been, doing discussion, studio visits, and really looking at people's art practice in this new social environment. Isn't that interesting?
It is. It is.
I feel like that's such a positive response to this situation that we inhabit. We're here, we're inhabiting this situation. We can't make it go away, just because we're tired of it. So there needs to be a response.
Yeah, and that response is it's not clear to us because it's too close to us. You can't focus when your hand is almost
Right.
up against your nose.
It's going to be so interesting over time. I'm going to make myself a note because I know we're running out of time. I'll send you the link for the show that my students did in the fall. And that was their theme. They decided to title the show Metamorphosis. And they were looking at their own change process in response to the environment that we were all finding ourselves in. And it's really, really fascinating. It's got all of their work and all of their artist statements over which they labored. They worked so hard. They write a couple of drafts. Some people wrote more than 2 drafts. But it's very fascinating, to see this situation from the point of view of people who are, getting ready to graduate from school and move on to the next thing, in an environment that's kind of moving under their feet. I mean, not that movement doesn't happen, but it's happening in a different way, and we're all really acutely aware of it.
Yeah, exactly. Just a quick note before I wrap up, and then I'll have you hang around afterwards when I hit the stop button, is the ability to write an artist statement seems so much easier now that I'm doing something that's objective, because I can speak about the narrative. Whereas before, speaking about the abstract, it was exactly that. Abstract.
So in therapy, we talk about creating a coherent narrative of your life. So in other words, whatever it is that happened, to have some perspective on it, have some understanding about it, be able to explain what happened. Doesn't matter if you're like 3 years old or if you're 70 years old, to be able to tell that story. So, going back in and finding that thread and pulling that narrative out of something non-objective, it's a different kind of process, isn't it?
Oh, for sure. For sure. Jane Ferris Richardson, thank you so much. This wraps up another episode, and hopefully this is only the first of what I hope to be several episodes with Jane as our guest. So this is Ron Fortier telling you thank you for joining us today. And it's still crazy out there, so be safe as you can be respectful of others. And until the next time, thank you so much for listening to us. Bye-bye.
We'll see you next week for another episode of the South Coast Artist Index podcast. The South Coast Artist Index podcast is brought to you in part by Heavenly Spirits, who invites you to celebrate the art of life and creative communities everywhere. Learn more at heavenlyspirits.com. To learn more about the South Coast Artist Index, visit theartistindex.com. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Be the artist you believe you are, and let's take care of each other out there.